Okay, so now we are moving on. So we're continuing with the cardiovascular system, but we're going to be talking about blood pressure and cardiac output, which is related to blood pressure. And this lecture is very heavy on concepts, so make sure that you're really understanding the relationship between different variables, because that's the hardest piece, understanding how they affect other variables. Okay, so let's talk about what blood pressure is. Blood pressure is the pressure exerted from the blood onto the artery walls, and it's specifically looking at artery walls because arteries take blood away from the heart, and so they're going to be experiencing the greatest pressure changes, whereas the veins take blood towards the heart, so they will have much more consistent lower pressures. So we're going to be looking at the artery walls. And so if you look at the arteries, here's the blood. So the blood is a liquid, and that blood is going to be pushing against the arteries. Okay, so how much it pushes against the walls of the arteries, that is blood pressure. And when you take a blood pressure reading, there are two readings that you'll take. The first is systolic. And systolic is the amount of pressure when the ventricles are contracting, right? So the systolic should be the high number because that is the amount of pressure when they're contracting and a whole bunch of blood goes out into it, it's going to push a lot more on the artery walls. Whereas the diastolic blood pressure reading is going to be the pressure on the artery walls when the ventricles are relaxed. And so that would be the lower number. So usually the typical way that they report it is systolic on the top and diastolic on the bottom. So for example, this would be called 120/80 is how they say that. Okay, so when the heart is contracting and when the ventricles are relaxed. Okay, so the biggest piece to today's lecture is understanding how different variables affect blood pressure and also looking at cardiac output. So the two major factors that affect the amount of blood pressure. So remember, it's just the pressure of the liquid, which is the blood, pushing against the artery walls. The ways that you can change the amount of pressure is by changing the volume of the blood, right? Higher volume, more pressure, more stuff in the same amount of space. And the second way to change the pressure is the diameter or the radius of the blood vessel, because that is going to tell you the volume that the blood is allowed to occupy, right? So pressure is just looking at the volume of the stuff in the space that it's found inside. Okay, so those are the two main factors that affect blood pressure. Now, within those two main factors, you have some smaller sort of sub-factors. So that could be just the amount of hydration. So if you're very, very dehydrated, you would have less plasma. Less plasma means lower blood, lower volume. Lower blood volume means lower blood pressure, right? So it could simply be the amount of plasma in the blood. Another thing that affects the volume of the blood is the cardiac output. And the cardiac output is basically the volume of blood that is pumped out of the heart per minute. So we're going to come back to that. So let's look at the vessel diameter. For the vessel diameter, remember that in the walls of the blood vessel, you have smooth muscle, and those smooth muscles can be contracted to constrict the blood vessel or relaxed to dilate the blood vessel, so vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Those are going to be regulated by the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system usually constricts it, and the sympathetic nervous system usually constricts it, and the parasympathetic nervous system usually dilates it. There are some changes for that. So, atherosclerosis, remember that is narrowing of the blood vessels. Okay, so this is the summary slide. Now we're going to get into all of these pieces with a lot more detail. So as we go through this, remember you want to focus on the relationship between one variable and another variable. Okay, so let's learn these terms real quick, make sure we're on the same page. If I say something is proportional, it just means that as one increases, the other one increases as well. As one decreases, the other one decreases as well. They go the same direction. Whereas inverse means opposite, so one increases, the other one decreases, and vice versa. Okay, so let's look at cardiac output. The cardiac output is the volume of blood that's pumped per minute. Now, please note that it has a time component on it. That means that it is a rate or a speed that blood is pumped. Okay, so it's not going, so the units for cardiac output is going to be milliliters or liters over minutes. Okay, so milliliters per minute. Okay, and it's going to be determined by two different factors. The first is stroke volume, and volume, the unit for stroke volume is going to be milliliters per beat. So the amount of blood that came out for every beat or contraction. So every time the heart beats or contracts, how much blood comes out in one single beat. And then the second factor that's going to affect it is heart rate. And heart rate is the beats per minute, so the number of contractions per minute. So if you put these together and you have the beats per, you have the volume per beat, and then you have the beat per minute. If you multiply them together, that's going to get rid of the beat part of the unit, and what you're left with is going to be the volume, usually milliliters or liters, per minute. So the cardiac output is the liters per minute. Okay, so let's look at factors that then affect each of those factors. Okay, so the two factors that affect cardiac output are stroke volume, the amount of blood that comes out for a contraction, and how often it contracts. That's going to give you how much blood is coming out per minute. Okay, so let's first look at heart rate. Remember that the cardiac muscle is autorhythmic, which means that it can set its own pace. That's going to be through the SA node, the sinoatrial node, which is located in the right atrium. It is the first one to depolarize. Remember that they can spontaneously depolarize, and once they reach the threshold, they'll make their action potential. That's usually about 75 beats per minute. So it can beat without any input at all from the nervous system, but the autonomic nervous system can influence the speed or the rate of the heart rate contractions. Okay, so if you have the sympathetic nervous system will make them depolarize more rapidly, so it's going to increase the heart rate, and the parasympathetic nervous system is going to make them depolarize more slowly, and that would decrease the heart rate. Okay, so fight or flight, sympathetic, rest and digest, parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so let's look at stroke volume. Remember, stroke volume is the amount of blood that comes out of the heart every time it contracts. The unit for stroke volume is usually milliliters or liters. Okay, so it's a volume unit. There are two factors that affect stroke volume. You have in diastolic volume and in systolic volume. Now those sound very similar, so let's slow down to make sure we really understand what that means. So what we're looking at for this one is in diastolic volume is the volume of blood at the end of diastole. Diastole is the relaxation phase, the filling phase. So what we're looking at for real is the in diastolic volume is the amount of blood that goes into the heart before the contraction. Okay, so I think of it as the in amount. Okay, how much goes in at the beginning. And then the in systolic volume, systolic means contraction. So what we're looking at is the volume of blood at the end of systole, after the contraction. Okay, so what this really means is how much blood is left in the heart after the contraction, because a contraction is not 100% efficient. A little bit of blood is going to be left inside of the heart. Okay, so if you look at it here, stroke volume is the amount of blood that comes out, and it is equal to the amount of blood that went in the first place minus the amount of blood that was stuck in. Okay, so we have diastole, where it's filling up. The amount that goes in is the end diastolic volume. Then you'll have the contraction, which would create the stroke volume. So the amount of blood that came out is the stroke volume. And the amount of blood that's left over would be the end systolic volume. Think of it like the residual blood that can't come out, that's stuck inside. Okay, and so here is the equation, but really you shouldn't really need to memorize this equation. It should be logical to you, right? If more of the blood is stuck in, less will come out. If more went in the first place, more will come out, right? More in, more out. So if you increase in diastolic volume, you're going to increase stroke volume. And if you increase in systolic volume, more stuck in, you're going to decrease stroke volume, because if more is stuck in, less can come out. Okay, so it really takes a little bit of practice. You might want to play around with how they relate to each other, but you should definitely understand the relationship between these three variables. Okay, we are about to what I call level up. Okay, so now that you kind of get that piece, let's talk about factors that affect both of these pieces here. Okay, so you can see I organize the lecture so it kind of gets more and more kind of challenging as we go through. Okay, so let's look about factors that would obstruct the stroke volume, either by affecting in diastolic volume, the amount that goes in, or affecting in systolic volume, which is the amount that is stuck in the heart. So the first one is called preload. And what preload is if you take the cardiac muscle and you stretch it before you contract, you're going to cover more distance. Right, so if you increase the venous return, the amount of blood that's returned to the heart from the veins, that is going to make it so that because it has more volume in there, that'll stretch the cardiac muscle out a little bit, which will cause it to contract a greater distance, and that'll create an increase in stroke volume. Okay, so what preload does is it increases in diastolic volume, more blood goes in, and therefore more blood comes out. Okay, so preload has a proportional relationship to stroke volume, because increase in preload means increase in stroke volume. More blood in, more blood out. Okay, the next one, contractility. So contractility is just a fancy way of saying force of the contraction. Okay, so this is going to be increased with sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system can make the cardiac muscle contract with more force. And that's why when you're like exercising, your heart's really like boom, boom, like if you can feel it. It's got a lot more force there. So that is the strength of the contraction. If the heart is contracting with more force, that's going to cause more of the blood to come out. And so that also has a proportional relationship with stroke volume, because if you're forcing more of the blood out, so more comes out. Okay, so stronger heartbeat, stronger contraction, more blood coming out. You can also think about how this would decrease the amount of in systolic volume, because if more comes out, less will be left inside. Okay, so contractility, how strong the heart is. And this is going to be affected by training. So if you are like really athletic and you train a lot, do a lot of endurance training, you can actually increase your contractility so that your heart is more efficient for every contraction, and that would cause an increase in stroke volume. That's a hint for your worksheet. Okay, so let's look at afterload. This one here is a little bit challenging, so let's pay a lot of attention just now. So for afterload, what that is the resistance to leave the heart. I think of it like the pushback. So as the heart is contracting, the blood is going to be moving into the arteries, but because of the resistance that's already found in the arteries, so resistance such as plaques, atherosclerosis, or high blood pressure, what that does is it makes it so that the blood cannot leave. Okay, it's being pushed back. It's got to push back. And because you're increasing the pushback, that makes it so that the blood has a harder time of leaving the ventricles. And if it can't leave, less will leave. So what would happen to stroke volume? If less can leave, less will leave, and therefore stroke volume would decrease. So afterload has an inverse relationship to stroke volume because it makes it so that the blood is unable to leave as easily. It's got some resistance to flow out of the heart. And if it can't leave, less will leave, more will be stuck in the heart, and the stroke volume would decrease. So an increase in afterload means a decrease in stroke volume. Okay, so that was anything to do with resistance to blood flow leaving the heart. Okay, so here's my summary slide right here. So remember that cardiac output is one of the things that affects the volume of blood, which would then affect blood pressure. So let's look at the various factors that affect cardiac output. Cardiac output is the amount, the volume of blood leaving the heart per minute. Okay, so the speed of blood flowing from the heart. It's affected by both heart rate, how often the heart contracts, and how much comes out for each contraction. That would be stroke volume. Now, the heart rate is going to be changed or altered by the autonomic nervous system. Parasympathetic nervous system decreases it. See how you have a dotted line here? That means that it inhibits it, it decreases it. And a solid line means that it increases it. So if you have the parasympathetic nervous system decreasing heart rate and stroke volume is staying the same, so the same is coming out per contraction, but you have fewer contractions, what's going to happen to cardiac output? A decrease in heart rate means a decrease in cardiac output, right? If you contract less often, less will come out per minute. Okay, hopefully that makes sense to you. If not, you need to play around with the variable sum. Now, what about a stroke volume? Okay, so what happens if you leave heart rate the same, but you decrease the stroke volume? So you're still contracting as often as ever, but you're getting more blood out so you're increasing stroke volume, more blood out per contraction, heart rate stays the same. What happens to cardiac output? An increase in stroke volume means an increase in cardiac output. Okay, now what happens if you increase heart rate but decrease stroke volume at the same amount, at the same time? So an increase in heart rate but a decrease in stroke volume. What then would happen to cardiac output? It would stay the same. Okay, one goes up, other goes down. Cardiac output, it's a wash. They counteract each other. Okay, so let's look at the factors. So for stroke volume, the stroke volume is going to be mediated by the end-systolic volume and the end-diastolic volume. Preload increases end-diastolic volume, which would then increase stroke volume. So more goes in, more comes out. And if you increase stroke volume, then therefore the cardiac output would also increase. So an increase in preload makes an increase in stroke volume, which would therefore increase cardiac output. If I ask you questions like that, I strongly recommend that you take it back to stroke volume first, figure out that variable, and then take it to cardiac output. If you try to jump straight to cardiac output, sometimes you can get confused. So increase in preload, increase in stroke volume, which would then increase cardiac output. Okay, let's talk about contractility. Contractility is the strength, how much force is generated when you contract the heart. If you contract it with more force, more of the blood will come out. So an increase in stroke volume and an increase in stroke volume means an increase in cardiac output. So both preload and contractility have a proportional relationship to both stroke volume and then also cardiac output. Now, the afterload. So for example, if you have high blood pressure, which would increase the resistance to leave the heart because the thing that's causing blood to flow is moving from a high pressure to a lower pressure. And if the pressures are closer together, it makes it harder to leave. And so that high blood pressure, that's going to increase afterload. And see this dotted line? It has a negative effect. So an inverse relationship. So an increase in afterload means that less can come out. So if less can leave, less will leave. So a decrease in stroke volume would then result in a decrease in cardiac output. Okay, so afterload has an inverse relationship with both stroke volume and therefore cardiac output as well. Okay, so I know that this feels like a lot. So what I really need you to do is go to work on those worksheets, really try each of those pieces, try it without the key first, and then look up your answers. This is just going to take some practice to really think through how the variables affect each other. Okay, last piece we need to talk about, the baroreceptor reflex. Okay, so remember we're kind of going back towards blood pressure. So the function of the baroreceptor reflex is to maintain consistent blood pressure. So blood pressure homeostasis. And like all the other homeostasis out there, it has 5 components of that negative feedback loop. So the negative feedback loop is the mechanism to maintain the blood pressure homeostasis. Okay, so let's look through how that works. Here is the negative feedback loop right here. So we'll just look at the top, but you could look at the bottom as well. It's the same thing. Okay, so you try to maintain a very kind of consistent range of blood pressure. Okay, so normal range of the blood pressure. If the blood pressure increases, okay, so the stimulus would be the increase in blood pressure. That is going to be sensed by the receptor. In this case, the receptor is the baroreceptor, which is a mechanoreceptor that is stimulated when the blood vessels stretch. Okay, so when you stretch the blood vessels, that'll activate the baroreceptors. The baroreceptors then take that information to the brain, and the brain would therefore be the control center. And then from there, the brain is going to decide what to do. That's why it's the control center, and it's going to do 2 things. The first is it's going to take the efferent pathway to the heart, and it'll cause the heart rate and the stroke volume to decrease. When you decrease heart rate and stroke volume, you're going to decrease cardiac output. Okay, so which division of the autonomic nervous system would decrease heart rate? That would be the parasympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system would be the efferent with an E, efferent pathway from the brain to the heart. It also will go to the blood vessels, and it causes vasodilation. When you do vasodilation, because there's more volume for the blood to occupy, that will also decrease the blood pressure. Okay, so the decrease in blood pressure would then return it back to the normal effect. So let's go through real quick the 5 components. The stimulus would be the increase in blood pressure. The receptor would be the baroreceptor because it's what senses the change. The control center would be the brain. The efferent pathway would be the parasympathetic nervous system. The effector would be the heart and the blood vessels, so 2 effectors. And then the response would be the decrease in heart rate and also vasodilation. So remember, response is the action taken by the body to go back to the change. It's not the going back to the change itself. Okay, so the action taken would be a decrease in heart rate and vasodilation, and then that would return it back to normal. Okay. If you were going the other way and increase a drop in blood pressure, you would do the opposite. You would increase the heart rate to increase cardiac output, and you would cause vasoconstriction, because if you have less volume to occupy, same amount of blood, that's going to create more pressure because you're just sort of squishing the blood into a smaller space. That increases blood pressure back up, and you go back through this way. So the division of the autonomic nervous system that takes care of this pathway would be the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so so just to make sure we understand, how would the body compensate for an increase in blood pressure? When I say compensate, I mean try to go the other way. So we're looking for things that would decrease blood pressure. So you're going to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. What actions happen as a result? Okay, you would decrease the heart rate. When you decrease in heart rate, decrease in cardiac output, less volume then, which would decrease blood pressure. And you're going to decrease stroke volume, decrease in stroke volume, decrease in cardiac output, decrease in blood volume, decrease in blood pressure. And then the third one would be vasodilation, because vasodilation, if you have more space for the blood to occupy, bigger volume for the space to occupy, that makes it so same amount of blood in there, but more space for it, that will decrease the pressure. Okay, so I really, really strongly encourage you to go work on those cardiovascular worksheets, because this lecture is not just about memorizing the pieces, but understanding how they all fit together. Okay, happy studies.